Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. I am Amani Jamal, Dean of the school, and I'm so happy to see you here today for our Dean's Leadership Series. The Princeton Policy Advocacy Clinic is a shining example of the school's commitment to its mission of serving the nation and all of humanity. This first of its kind program immerses undergraduate students in the policymaking process through both in-class instruction and hands-on engagement. It teaches students how to find policy solutions for social problems and then engages them in campaigns to advance those policies. Multiple student teams from the Policy Advocacy Clinic have worked on projects with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. We are grateful to have the UNHCR as a stalwart partner, and we are honored today to welcome the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to Princeton SPIA. Volker Türk has devoted his long and distinguished career to advancing universal human rights, notably the international protection of some of the world's most vulnerable people, refugees, and stateless populations. For the last 2.5 years, he has served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Prior to this, Dr. Türk held several key positions with the Office of the UNHCR in Geneva, as well as Malaysia, Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Kuwait. Dr. Türk also worked in policy and strategic coordination in the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General. One final item before we get started, I'd like to emphasize that Princeton SPIA is a place of constructive, respectful dialogues. We share the university's commitment to free expression. However, disruptive conduct will not be tolerated. We welcome everyone to engage in a civil manner. Thank you to Volker Türk for joining us today and to everyone in attendance. Thanks as well to Princeton SPIA's Udi Ofer, the John L. Weinberg Goldman Sachs & Company visiting professor and lecturer of public international affairs for moderating today's events. He's also the brainchild behind the Policy Advocacy Clinic. And today's event is made possible by the Rawson Leadership Fund, to which I extend our gratitude. I'm looking forward to a very stimulating discussion on how the United Nations is working to safeguard human rights amid this global crisis and a shifting world order. Udi and Volker, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Well, Madam Dean, Professor Ufer, distinguished guests, dear students and faculty members, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. And my warm thanks to the School of Public and International Affairs and everyone who has been involved in this event. Princeton University has made incredible contributions to our world. Nobel laureates, presidents, Supreme Court justices, titans of industry, philanthropists, economists have walked these halls. And several important champions of human rights, including peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh, late Vietnamese Buddhist monk, and pioneering writer like Maria Ressa, have all been here, I understand, at some point in their lives. Today, students at Princeton don't just learn about human rights, you are active participants in shaping our global human rights frameworks. And my warm thanks to Professor Udi Ofer and the group of students who traveled to my office in Geneva last year in connection with the struggle for racial justice. And it's really, really great to be here. We meet at a challenging time for human rights around the world. We have some 120 conflicts that rage, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, in about 59 countries. And these conflicts have a devastating impact on civilians, on civilian infrastructure, and particularly the most vulnerable. Legal frameworks designed to protect civilians, like the Geneva Conventions, are, I'm afraid to say, disregarded and at times even dismissed. Sexual violence and starvation are used as weapons of war in blatant violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. Deadly weapons flow freely across borders, while life-saving aid is blocked. From Sudan to Ukraine, from the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Myanmar to Gaza, parties to armed conflict are riding roughshod over laws of war. I'm horrified by the resumption of attacks in Gaza. Tens of thousands of civilians, including hundreds of our own staff, have already been killed. It is imperative that the ceasefire is restored, that humanitarian aid is reestablished, and that the remaining hostages are released immediately and unconditionally. It is clear that there is absolutely no justification for the atrocities committed by Hamas and others against Israel on 7 October last year. It is equally clear that there's no justification for the collective punishment by Israel of the Palestinian people. In Sudan, civilians are paying an unbearable price as two generals battle for power and resources, and I had a chance to meet both of them before they started the war. The generals and their allies have launched devastating attacks on densely populated areas with utter disregard for international law. Thousands have been killed, more than 8 million displaced, and some 25 million people face hunger. There are now deeply disturbing reports of widespread killings of civilians in the capital, Khartoum, which was recaptured by the Sudanese armed forces last month, and you probably saw my press comment on this week. We cannot allow horrific practices, including the use of chemical weapons, as we saw in Syria, attacks on healthcare, as we see in so many conflicts around the world, and torture to become normalized. Closer to home, here in the United States, there is a situation, very special situation in Haiti, where people are trapped in a spiraling violence. The state is simply not there to provide protection to protection to the human rights of people. And I met with my designated expert actually last night, and he told me that because he had just been to Haiti, and he told me how harrowing the situation is. The airport doesn't function anymore. The gangs have essentially taken over 90% of the territory, of the metropolitan territory of Port-au-Prince. And it's almost impossible. I mean, the country is suffocating under this horrible violence that occurs. And it's just, well, a couple of 100 kilometers away. Even in countries that are supposedly at peace, many people feel insecure and unmoored. As economic growth slows, austerity policies bite into people's daily lives. Jobs are precarious, paychecks buy less. Governments talk of cutting fraud and waste when they're actually cutting benefits to the poorest and taxes on the rich. Climate chaos is already upon us, as we see it almost on a monthly basis, with the warming rates going up and always having a new record. But we also know that the most vulnerable people are suffering the deadly consequences of what's happening for the climate. We also see that these developments feed alienation, sometimes cynicism, but also loss of trust in institutions. We see how communities struggle with polarization while demagogues thrive on the extremes. Around the world, civil liberties and political rights have declined for 19 years straight, according to Freedom House. Refugees and migrants live in fear as they are demonized and scapegoated. LGBTIQ+ people, particularly transgender people, face harassment and violence simply for being who they are. People with disabilities are stigmatized and rejected. Women and girls face pervasive discrimination, from the denial of their sexual and reproductive rights to gender-based persecution in Afghanistan, for example. Toxic ideas about masculinity are gaining ground, especially on social media platforms. Human rights themselves are under attack as activists, lawyers, journalists, civil society groups are threatened and subjected to harassment and disinformation. So far, so familiar. I'm sure many of you recognize the world I've just described, but we are not powerless to resist these trends. This is not some kind of natural disaster. It is entirely man-made, and I use the term advisedly because it's the result of decisions taken largely by men. To find solutions, we need to analyze and understand how we got here. The erosion of the rule of law is both cause and consequence of a world in disarray. The rule of law is the simple but powerful principle that all of us, countries, corporations, citizens, are accountable to a fair set of common standards. The rule of law protects the vulnerable, prevents discrimination, harassment, and other abuses, helps to resolve disputes, and defends against atrocity crimes. It fosters trust in each other and in public institutions, and it supports strong, cohesive, resilient communities and society, and it makes indeed states safer, more prosperous, and more secure. That's really the very core of what the rule of law entails. Today, at the global level, when we see a growing disregard for international law and unprecedented attacks on multilateral institutions and frameworks, the essential international treaties from the Paris Agreement to the Ottawa Convention on Landmines are being weakened as countries withdraw. And we also see the illegal use of force being normalized. The specter of nuclear confrontation is back. More than ever before, we need leadership for peace. And as students of governance, you are aware of the importance of global institutions that are doing essential work and have proven their value over decades. But today, some of these institutions are being smeared and defunded. I'm thinking of the World Health Organization, for example, but also the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, among others. And I'm deeply troubled that several countries are undermining the institutions that underpin international law, including the International Criminal Court. The court is a fundamental pillar of international criminal justice. We risk moving from the rule of law to the rule of lawlessness, from a world that aspires to justice and accountability to a world in which military might and enormous wealth allow the strong to prey on the weak, leaving no one and nowhere safe. We also see the rule of law being undermined at the national level in many countries. Some of this is deliberate, some is a product of our times. New technologies, including generative artificial intelligence, have unprecedented power to solve many of our global challenges, from hunger and poverty to the climate crisis, but they also pose new risks. National laws are developed by states. Today, those states are in retreat as a handful of unelected tech oligarchs and corporations expand their control and influence over our lives. Global tech companies are tracking our movements and our moods, our health and our habits, and people are unknowingly giving private corporations the ability to spy on them. This information can quickly find its way into the hands of people who wish to do them harm. Even more alarming, corporations use this data to manipulate us, from where we live and what we buy, to our skin temperature and heart rate. Tech companies have all the information they need to understand what triggers our emotional response and moves us to action. That action could be buying a toaster, or it could be casting a vote. Manipulation increases their profits and their power over us. All this is deeply worrying. And there is also evidence that bias in the analytical tools used by these programs contributes to further discrimination against marginalized groups. For example, they may assign more negative emotions to black faces than white faces. Such biases reinforce stereotypes, fuel discrimination, and increase inequalities. So it is really important that states fulfill their duty to protect their people from unchecked power wherever it is found. They must build legal frameworks that protect privacy, give people control over their data, and ensure it's not used by corporations without their consent. And they must educate people about the technology they use and how they can prevent their data being misused to manipulate them. But so far, many states are struggling. Unless they adapt to today's reality and protect people's rights and freedoms in the digital realm, we could be heading for new forms of oppression and subjugation. Dear friends, all over the world, demagogues and autocrats are using these incredible technologies as a tool to build and maintain their power. They are surveying and censoring their citizens to stifle free thinking and dissent. And they are spreading disinformation and lies on social platforms to increase divisions and polarization in our society, but also to distract people from the very real problems they face, and sometimes to feed fear, anger, dehumanization, and even violence. This is at its most obvious in the demonization of refugees. I devoted many years of my life to the protection of refugees and migrants and stateless people. What I miss in discussions on this issue today is their humanity. I'm concerned by the depiction of refugees and migrants in today's political debates, and I don't recognize the people who are being described. Under international law, refugees have a right to safety and asylum, and migrants, regardless of their status, enjoy human rights. And I want to recall history here. The 1951 Refugee Convention was born out of the experience of Jews, political dissidents, and others fleeing Nazi Germany, who were often sent back to their countries of origin to face death and danger. LGBTIQ+ people are also part of that history. And the recriminalization of consensual same-sex relationships in some countries, the backlash against the LGBTIQ+ community more generally, should worry us all. LGBTIQ+ people have played an important role in science, in culture, and the arts throughout history. The only thing that changes is the level of persecution they endure. And history has shown time and again that no one is safe when a marginalized group is scapegoated. And we see that today in online campaigns and hate speech against people with disabilities, against journalists, against human rights defenders, but also people who rely on government support. Social safety nets are intended to prevent people from falling into poverty and destitution. Diversity and inclusion policies are designed to create a level playing field after centuries of systemic racism and misogyny. Fundamentally, they are about the idea that we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights. And let's be clear, those rights did not appear fully formed as a gift to the world. Sometimes they are portrayed as luxuries that are nice to have. But the history of human rights is one of hardship, struggle, and even bloodshed. People fought and died for our human rights, the right to justice, equal treatment before the law, the right to speak out, the right to education, to health, the right to live without discrimination. Think of the civil rights movement, think of the Civil War, and the Universal Declaration itself that emerged from two world wars, the Great Depression and the horrors of the Holocaust. It was intended as a blueprint, a compass, to help guarantee standards of governance around the world. Universities are the natural home of discussion and dialogue around what our rights mean and how to protect them in the 21st century. That open and frank debate is what helps us progress. As a young student, I myself admired the strong tradition of activism, freedom of expression, and peaceful assembly in American universities. But today I'm very concerned about attempts to limit debate and peaceful protests on several US university campuses, including the intimidation and arrest of students for exercising their legitimate rights, no matter where they're from. Anti-Semitism is abhorrent, and I condemn it unreservedly. But I also reject attempts to label all criticism of Israeli government policies and military operations as anti-Semitic. Free speech is fundamental to society, particularly when there is a sharp disagreement on major issues. It must never be conflated with incitement to violence or hatred. Just as the challenges we face are interconnected, our solutions must also be linked. I believe that starts with putting humanity back at the heart of policy. Some governments are failing to fulfill their most basic task to support and protect their people. While markets have taken an almost sacred status, people are being left behind. But consider in contrast the Southern African concept of Ubuntu, an idea that I'm sure you're aware. Ubuntu is a value-based system on the principle that and I quote, "I am what I am because of who you are." It's a concept that emphasizes the interconnectedness and unity of humanity. Ubuntu stresses that no one would be who they are without the support and contributions of everyone else, and that we all have a responsibility to our fellow human beings. Ubuntu is also about what makes us authentically human and is therefore intrinsically linked with our inalienable human rights. These ideas clearly exist in many other cultures and places. And in my own position, I often am confronted that people say, oh, human rights is a Western construct. Well, actually, I think a lot of studies have shown that indeed it's a universal one, and Ubuntu is not least one of those concepts, but you have them in all spiritual, religious, cultural traditions in all parts of the world, and that's what human rights at the end is also about. I believe that Ubuntu and related ideas and philosophies offer an incredible array of solutions to the challenges we face, particularly at the community and national levels. For example, when it comes to justice, Ubuntu emphasizes repairing relationships, replacing what is lost or damaged, forgiving and reconciling. But how often do we hear these words in our fragmented, confrontational politics today? And I think when you see countries emerge from conflict and we talk about transitional justice, it's essentially about that: truth-telling, memorialization, reparations. Today's human rights challenges demand a shift away from top-down approaches that have been co-opted by big tech, by autocrats and markets, to initiatives that are based on unity, solidarity, and Ubuntu in our communities. Human rights defenders and other civil society groups have a huge role to play. We must break down the silos that divide human rights causes, and we need to work much more together to create a global movement against discrimination and dehumanization that is based on race, on gender, indigenous status, caste, disability, income, sexual orientation, or any other factor. We must really strengthen alliances, carry each other's message, and voice support for each other with a strong focus on wisdom, justice, and compassion. And we must find ways to embed human rights into digital technologies and put the rights of young people and future generations at the forefront. As Princeton students, you have unparalleled access to opportunities, information, and connections around the world. I urge you to put your energy and your creativity, your access, and yes, your privilege, to work for the common good. I urge you to consider what you can do to support and protect human rights today and in the future. Strive to ensure that everyone has access to adequate housing, education, health, as a matter of right. Push for the protection of refugees, of migrants, and other minorities that are targeted and scapegoated. Question harmful narratives that dehumanize vulnerable people. Never underestimate your own personal contribution, which is more important and urgent than ever. I encourage you to be part of the solution, to continue the global tradition of this beautiful and world-leading university, and to work within your communities and beyond for peace, dignity, and human rights for all. Thank you very much.
Okay. So the way that the rest of the afternoon is going to go, I had some prepared questions, but I'm also going to adjust some of the questions in response to the remarks made by the High Commissioner. But first, I mean, I hear you carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I mean, I don't know if that's how other people also heard you. You could tell, like, the way you speak, the way you talk. It's both inspiring and also feels devastating. So I want to start off by just a bit of reflection, right? So it's been almost 2.5 years now that you've been in this incredible role. And I think it's fair to say that the way we would say it in America, you came out swinging, right? I think on your second day in office, you issued your first condemnation of Ethiopia for targeting civilians in Tigray. 2 weeks later, you were on the ground in Darfur, meeting with victims of the conflict there. A month later, you were condemning Iran for its suppression of protests, and one of my students is writing her thesis on that issue. A year almost to the date of your tenure, you have, the conflict in Gaza beginning, and I think you've been incredibly consistent with, condemning Hamas and condemning Israel when they cross lines. You came in full force. Here we are now 2.5 years later, right? And the Council of Foreign Relations recently came out with a report predicting that 2025 will be the deadliest year in the 17 years that they've been tracking. And you said as much when it came to civil and political rights, right? We could list on, and you did all of the ongoing conflicts. You've recognized, I listened to your opening remarks at the 58th Human Rights Council session, and you quote unquote sounded the alarm. So reflect on the last 2.5 years. Are we better off today? Are we worse off? What is the story that you would tell on your tenure over the last 2.5 years?
No, I think very good description that you've just given. And one can actually be very quickly does it work?
I think you may have to turn it on. So there should be, if you go into your pocket. I know, I'm so loud. It is on.
Yeah. Is it on? Can you hear me?
No, it's not on. There should be a green light. Ooh.
Oh, now there is. So now you can hear me. No. Look, I think you gave a very apt description of these past 2.5 years. I think it is important, though, when it comes to human rights, to look at it in a much larger historical perspective. And all the battles that we have today, and you can get very quickly overburdened by the doom and gloom and the violations. But we should also not forget, and that's what also keeps me going, I meet, when I go out to countries, people who I have the highest admiration and appreciation for. Sorry.
Yeah, it keeps coming in and out. Yeah. I think we need a different, we're coming. Yeah.
And Yes, I'm sorry for that. The right of your ears not to be affected. Look, I think so one can actually get very quickly into this doom and gloom moment, and sometimes it almost makes you feel shell-shocked in some situations. And we really need to overcome that because, as I said, when I go out to countries, when I meet human rights defenders, civil society organizations around the world, I mean, they keep going. Of course, they are affected by the fact that, unfortunately, the funding gets less and less, which is a big problem.
We're going to talk about that.
But the human rights defenders out there who are really at the grassroots level, working with communities on a daily basis, they give me incredible inspiration. They should all give us inspiration because they keep doing their job. And I also see that despite all the doom and gloom, we see transformations happening. And I think it's important within because of course, conflict takes a lot of our time and space, but you have also the ones who are managing to get people out of detention. You are the ones who see that certain laws can be changed because there is a discussion with parliamentarians, for example. And it is this hard work of convincing, persuading, making sure that people understand. But what worries me more than ever before when I started is that we lose a little bit the essence of what human rights means in today's world, that we see sometimes very reductionist views. It's sort of, now, especially in this country, I see it sort of said it's wokeism. Well, wokeism I don't understand what it actually means when they talk about that. But what it really means, human rights, is about precisely all the daily grievances that people have. Adequate housing, single mom with 3 children trying to make ends meet, having 3 jobs, for example, because she can't afford access to education, access to healthcare. These are human rights, apart from, of course, civic space, freedom of expression, and political rights. So I sometimes fear that we lose the essence and the history of this amazing movement that has really changed all our lives in amazing ways. Of course, we have the violations and we will have to keep fighting them, but we also have this powerful force that human rights represents.
Yeah, and I think especially in the United States, I think, my own life, I actually have a professor here, Professor Flaherty, who taught me human rights law in law school. And to think of where we've come over the last 20 years here in the US, you just don't hear as much as you do when it comes to human rights framework outside the United States. But let's talk about money for a second and the US, because they go hand in hand. One of the goals that you had said when you became High Commissioner was to raise more money for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which the US helped found, right, in 1993, I think it is, right? One of the advocates for it. I think most folks don't know, but human rights is one of the main pillars of the creation of the United Nations, right? It's one of the 3 pillars in the preamble. Yet when you look at your budget, it doesn't feel that way, right? I mean, I think your budget is about, what, 5% of member funding. You rely heavily on voluntary contributions. And the United States has, since the founding of the United Nations, been the #1 contributor of UN government funding, I think around 28% of the budget. But then you have President Trump coming into office, I think 3 weeks into the office, issuing an executive order saying we're going to review all funding to the UN. Some of what he's done was very predictable, right? Withdrawing from the Human Rights Council, stopping aid to UNRWA, horrible, not justifying any of it. Some of it had already begun under President Biden, and I think didn't receive enough criticism for that. But I think it's fair to say that the US is going further now. So I guess 2 questions for you. What is the talk right now in your office when it comes to money? Because you need more money, I think that's fair to say. But B, how are you looking at the United States right now, right? Both as a source of funding for the United Nations, but then also as someone who's obligated to the principles and the laws that it has signed to. So for example, this year, the US is subject to the Universal Periodic Review. Some of my students are going to be working on that. Do you expect the US to participate? give us a sense of how are you thinking of the United States right now, both in terms of funding and actually being an active member of the human rights community?
Well, I mean, there's a certain feeling of mourning, because the US that I know, and that's bipartisan, has always been a United States that is committed to foreign assistance, to helping people around the world, to standing up for the rights of the vulnerable. And frankly, I have seen it happen in so many countries around the world and greatly benefited from the generosity of the American people. And I think that has actually been also serving the American people very well, because, you know, you are all working on governance issues. I mean, you know what soft power means. Soft power means we actually do good, but you also have influence as a result. And there are many people, I mean, many of the human rights defenders that I know, they were funded also by the US and others, but also by the US. And the US was always very particular about it because they supported women's groups, youth groups, human rights defenders, journalists that would otherwise be at great risk. And that's incredibly valuable. And a lot of those who were at risk at some stage ended up in government. But they owed it to the United States that they were able to do so many of these things. And I think, well, yes, now with this review of foreign assistance, we don't know where it will come out at the end. But of course, the fact that, you know, the funding was cut, the funding to my organization when it comes to the extra budgetary funding, I mean, not the regular budget, the voluntary funding. Yes, we had the US give us last year 30 million, 9 million to the torture fund, for example, which really helped survivors of torture around the world, about 50,000 or so. I mean, if we don't have
And
that,
you had to close down the Iraq.
we had the Iraq operation, our Colombia operation, which, you know, my office in Colombia was part of the peace process. We were there in 9 locations. We are there in 9 locations in the country, very close to where conflict rages, with human rights defenders, documenting and feeding back to the authorities when we see the violations. And we were verifying casualties and so forth. That work, well, 40% of the funding came from the US. Obviously, we are not going to have that money anymore at this point in time. The other thing is, and it's not just the US, unfortunately, also some of our European partners have cut the funding. So we have quite a serious situation. And, you know, of course, we make the case to everyone that human rights, it is not very much when you look at the overall funding that goes to humanitarian or development actors. We need to make maybe a better case that they see human rights as an investment in prevention, because if you don't prevent things from happening, you will actually end up with worse. And then you have to pay all the humanitarian money. But this is not just for the US, this goes for everyone, actually.
Do you expect the US to participate in the universal periodic review?
It's still too early to tell. I hope they will. It's a strong commitment. We have only one country that hasn't participated, that's Nicaragua. So I hope the US will keep its commitment to the universal periodic review.
So staying on that theme, you recognized in your talk around how we're seeing these, you know, erosion of rights globally, right? And for many students here, for many Americans, now they're seeing it here in the United States, right? In ways that, you know, haven't been seen in generations, if ever, right? Concepts around separation of powers, free speech, due process, equal protection. So what do you see as your role as the High Commissioner? What is the story? Although you did some of that already in your remarks, so you don't need to say that. But what do you see as your role, and how do you respond to what we're seeing as a backsliding of liberal democracies, including in the United States, which is, you know, the oldest democracy? So how do you see your role in responding to this?
Well, I wish we had an office here. We don't have an office here, but I think it's
maybe a
but I think
you know,
you know, I think it's a bigger issue in democracies more generally, and not just in the United States of America. I mean, I look at Europe as well. I look at what social media platforms do, and there is a clouding of the mind because harmful disinformation, if it becomes the new normal, and if, you know, there is a very good book by Mikutani on the death of truth, Michiko Kakutani, but sorry, I forgot the exact name. And it sort of describes what it means if you are no longer having a consensus about facts and what facts are. And then there is this blurring of distinction between facts and fiction, which, by the way, some would say is psychotic when you start actually no longer knowing what reality is and what, you know, you go into these alternate ethers. And social media have had certainly a huge role to play in this because people end up in their echo chambers. We don't, I mean, we wish, I mean, I come from a generation, some of you as well, who were not growing up with the tech that, of course, has been incredibly useful. But we had public spaces where you could have fierce disagreements, of course, in a respectful way. But you actually try to find a solution. That's what democracy is all about. You need this open space. But what you see today is echo chambers, people listening to themselves, not reaching out. So for us, the biggest issue is how to reach out to the voters who feel, for whatever reason, aggrieved, who don't trust institutions anymore, and we need to understand it. And I think that's, again, human rights is a good connector. It is a good way of having a conversation about what actually is about what people care about.
So this is a perfect segue to a question I wanted to ask you that is a uniquely American question. And I'm on, you know, I worked at the ACLU for 20 years before coming to Princeton. I'm a civil liberties, constitutional law lawyer. And you just talked about, you know, contention and how to address it. Because I agree with the way you described the problem. But I also want to get your views on the uniquely American First Amendment principles, particularly around hate speech, right? So we have right now, so first let me just state the obvious here. We're seeing unprecedented, in many ways, attacks on First Amendment rights when it comes to non-citizens in the United States. I mean, we've all seen the images of green card holders, of you know, people on temporary visas literally being snatched up in their homes based solely, as far as we know, because no additional evidence has been provided, on First Amendment protected speech. So that is an issue real. I'm proud of the NGO communities in the United States taking that on, including the ACLU. We have here Jamil Dakwar, who's the head of the ACLU Human Rights Program. But there's also a uniquely American view on this, and that is in the United States, hate speech is protected speech, right? Now, there are exceptions, incitement, true threat, on campus, discriminatory harassment, but the law is very, very different than under historic human rights principles under European law. The theory of it is actually what you just said, right? The theory behind it is that the best way to deal with hate speech is with more speech, not less speech, right? The marketplace of ideas. That is not how human rights law has historically approached it. So how do you look at the United States when it comes to this?
I mean, I looked at some Supreme Court decisions. There are some elements of exceptions when it comes to
threats,
and so forth. I think some of these areas of law, including, by the way, for international human rights law, because of course, Article 19 and Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights does foresee exceptions, clearly identified. And, you know, of course, we don't want to end up in a situation where you suddenly repress. And unfortunately, we have too many situations around the world where we see the repression of freedom of speech and freedom of opinion and freedom of expression and so forth. The biggest problem that I see for all of us, and it doesn't matter whether it's in the constitutional framework of the United States or more broadly under international human rights law, is how do you deal with a very different environment where issues of content moderation on social media platforms come in, for example, or incitement to violence. Well, incitement is already protected. I mean, you can't do incitement to violence here, but the whole hate speech thing, because I'll give you one example. Myanmar, Burma. When the Rohingya were expelled in 2017, it was preceded by a campaign of hatred that took place on one of the social media platforms. And actually there is one mechanism on the monitoring of the situation, of human rights monitoring in the situation in Myanmar, and they did a lot of analysis how much that has contributed to the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya people, which, by the way, is now before the International Court of Justice, because the question is whether it was genocide.
Right.
And that really we'll have to ask ourselves if we see that social media platforms are used in such a way without content moderation. In this case, that particular social media platform didn't have even an interpreter, or one who spoke Bamar, but not the other languages, so it didn't even know what was going on. And the hate speech was so rampant and so severe that it was a massive contributing factor to systematic, widespread human rights violations that occurred. And I think that alone should, and I'm sure that would be covered in the US context, the Constitution context, but it's not, then there are different nuances to this, right? Because when does it start? And we have, through the framework of analysis on atrocity crimes, we know that it can start quite early. It starts with bias that becomes more and more acceptable. I mean, the history of anti-Semitism, if you look at, how that has happened and how this then leads to dehumanization. So I do think, especially in an environment where we have social media platforms that don't take their responsibilities seriously under content moderation, yes, we need to look at regulation.
So one last question before I open it up to audience questions. So one of the criticisms that you have received that I disagree with, but one of the criticisms is around how you choose to use your office resources, given that it's limited, the issues that you choose to focus on. Again, as someone who follows your work incredibly closely, I actually think it's incredible how much, you cover. But a criticism is that, you give too much attention to some issues, too little attention to other issues. So can you give us, how do you make these decisions, right? Given that you recognize there are 120 conflicts in the world, given the enormity of the issue, you have a small office, only 5% of the UN budget. How do you choose what to talk about and what to highlight and what your staff should work on?
I mean, it is clear when you have so many conflicts around the world, we are forced to focus a lot on them. I mean, that's very clear. And in some instances, we are more present than in others, because in some countries, you are actually able to work in these conflict situations. We are able to, I mean, Ukraine is a good example. We have issued, I don't know how many reports on the situation in Ukraine, but we have 90 staff there. So we are able to do our job in a proper way. I mean, in Sudan, we have only 3 international staff left because of the situation. So in Myanmar, we are not allowed in. So we have to do it from the outside. So but it is clear that conflict and human rights violations and IHL, international humanitarian law violations in conflict are a huge problem, because if we are not following it, the erosion of the law is going to be a factor that has to be taken into account. And we are persistent objectors, because we don't want countries to learn from what's happening in different country contexts and say, okay, now distinction, precaution, proportionality can be, you broaden the edges of the interpretation so that you can kill more people, more civilians, in order to reach a military target. I mean, and obviously, we see these arguments then being made by Sudan, by Russia, by others, and we have to be very careful about that, because then it could be made by any country, because they will say, well, here it was allowed to happen, in other contexts it was not. So we need to be very careful. And I think my role is to be a persistent objector. Of course, states have the same role, but my role is to not allow the emergence of a new normal that is extremely detrimental to civilians. So that definitely is a big priority. At the same time, I'm worried about us getting caught up in the immediate and the urgent and not seeing the broader picture and not seeing what actually needs to be done so that we don't end up in the conflict in the first place. Right. And this is about inequalities. It is about climate change. And, you know, I meet a lot of politicians and political leaders. I'm sometimes worried when I meet with them that they're so caught up in the short term and not looking at the long term. And we actually desperately need leaders today that have a long-term vision and that work on the long-term vision, because we know that all of us are being affected by the failures of today if we're not addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, and all these things. And we have, I think it's a big governance issue, by the way. It's a big governance issue for all of us who are working in the governance area. How do we address the short-termism with the long-term strategic thinking, but also with strategic foresight, because the decisions that we take today may have an impact on future generations. And that's huge. And we cannot afford to not do this type of work as well. Of course, there are less resources available, that's clear, but I still want to make sure that we put the human rights angle on this as well, including on the economy, by the way.
Yeah. Okay, let's open it up to questions. So if anyone has a question, Professor Flaherty.
Should I just shout? Oh, with the mic there? Okay. Is this working? Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you very much for coming here to Princeton and for your remarks and for all the work you do. I think it's very important that Princeton builds closer connections to the United Nations in general and to your office and to human rights mechanisms in particular. So kudos to my former student, Professor Ofer, and to Dean Jamal. But I wouldn't be a human rights person if I didn't ask you a challenging question. So it's the flip side of the United States receding, at least for the foreseeable future, from participation in UN human rights mechanisms and funding. And so the sort of obvious nation that's going to fill that vacuum is going to be China. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, since your predecessor's report is somewhat dated, what is your office's assessment, which is difficult because you can't go in, about what's going on today in Xinjiang and Hong Kong and China itself, but then more broadly, the PRC's influence in changing the human rights discourse at the Human Rights Council, at the General Assembly, and also the influence that its greater comparative funding is going to have at the UN as the United States, does not fund as much.
Well, I think it's very clear that whenever you recede, someone else will take the place. And I don't think it's only in relation to China. I think you have it in relation to other actors as well. What I fear is that if there is not strong conviction that the human rights cause is part also of the future of the UN, you will see an erosion of the system as a whole. I mean, we have a UN 80 initiative going on at the moment. I fully agree with you, and I keep reminding all those who are the so-called friends of the Charter, and these are some countries who would say, when you criticize them, including China, it's domestic interference, and it's sovereignty issues, and so forth. I keep reminding them that actually, well, if you look at the Charter was absolutely clear. The Charter allows us, first of all, human rights are a matter of international concern. That's why you created these institutions. And they are also born out of experience, right? If you don't make it an international issue, then yes, then we will have the repressive machinery that continues.
And remind the United States it was the main proponent of that.
And the US played an incredibly important role. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of the commission at the time. So I do think that, and it also means, because of the Charter, that the criticism of human rights issues is not an interference. It's a legitimate concern, and you're allowed to do it. And we need to push back, especially against this. In my own experience, I don't have that problem. I've never heard anyone, and I have some, you can imagine the type of interlocutors that I see, I've never had anyone push back when I raise human rights concerns. So that is in a way a positive. And I also, when we had the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1923, there was a consensus resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council. And Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I mean, for the benefit of everyone, I mean, it has civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights, because it was Eleanor Roosevelt who made sure that the economic, social, cultural rights are in there. It wasn't, it was not, and again, I think against her own State Department at the time. But there was consensus about this, including by China. China is a member of the Human Rights Council. So that I've never heard anyone question the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that for me is always the entry point, because you cannot only talk about development, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has the full package. It didn't have right to development, right to environment in there, but it's implicit. So for me, the value of the principles and of the norms, you can't take that away. And that's also in my own interventions, in my own engagement with China, that's part of course, I use that.
Yes, sir. Student.
Well, danke vielmals. Das war hervorragend. Thank you very much. It was absolutely outstanding. I was quite taken by some of your insights where one begins to, I keep saying, overwhelmed with issues. One begins to be numb to suffering. But my early life, professional life, was shaped by a picture coming from the inner Yugoslav war of somebody hanging over a fence, and it reminded us on the suffering. Perception forms reality. So my question to you is, how can we ascertain that in critical issues we face the real reality and we hear about the real reality? And you used my term dehumanization. And how can we make sure that we break through this mold in a time when you have artificial intelligence and you can artificially create realities?
Want me to answer? I mean, look, I
Why don't we actually do this way?
Oh, yeah, I can do it.
So we only have a few minutes left. Any other questions, particularly students, and let's get them all in there. Yeah. So 1, 2, 3, and then we'll give you the last word.
I just take note.
So I think you were first. Okay, you're first. Doesn't matter. All 3 of you will get to ask. We'll get through all 3, I promise.
Hello, well, thank you. I am Consola. I'm an MPA student. And I wanted to ask that when we think of refugees, we usually refer to the 1951 convention, right? And the principle of non-refoulement. And so once refugees reach territory, right? However, many authors say that or propose that this can be very tricky because in the end, countries end up putting many barriers for them to actually reach territory. And so from a human rights perspective, how do you see this perspective impacting the future of refugees?
2 and 3, yeah. Thank you for taking notes.
Thank you. Thank you, High Commissioner. So my name's Tanisha, I'm a Princeton alumni. I actually work for DPPA, so I'm sort of cheating. I've got 2 very quick questions. The first was on your comments about the power and role of tech oligarchs. Given that you have a very senior role within the UN, which is a member state and government-driven organization, how do you see your ability to interface with them, given the newly outsized importance in how the whole world is sort of structured and governed? And then the second very, very quick question is, we're sort of, it seems, or it feels like we're living in a state where the human psyche, there is this insatiable desire for power by some who have power, who wield it. I think there's talk about the world's richest man aspiring to become the world's first trillionaire. Like, How do you see in terms of putting some pullback, and we talked about grassroots and local initiatives and the role of NGOs, but how do you also contend with that psychological aspect of what it is that the challenge is at the heart of the challenge? Thank you.
Great. Okay, and last question was over there.
I have a question about your proposal for more regulation of social media for content moderation concerning incitement to violence. Specifically, who do you think should be in charge of this kind of regulation, considering that there's an obvious conflict with civil liberties, right to freedom of speech, and the countries in which there is currently the most, if you want to call it, content moderation of the internet, are usually those you consider human rights offenders, and some of those in those countries affected by this censorship of the speech can be classified as human rights defenders. So who should be in charge of this? And specifically, would you trust the current US administration to come up with such a regulation?
Okay, so there are 4 questions in front of you. Pick your poison, and this will be the wrap-up remark.
Right. Yeah. Look, sometimes I'm asked, or I'm thinking about how can you encapsulate best what human rights are. And I think one way to do it is to establish the facts, which is what we do when we monitor, document, and report. And we have a very strict methodology. I mean, when we report on what's happening around the world, we have a verification process that is at least 3 independent sources in order to be able to say something about it. And of course, it makes some countries extremely unhappy, as you can imagine. So you have the fact, you establish the fact. Then it's the law, because we have a normative basis, after all, which makes it so strong. I mean, we have international human rights law, we have international humanitarian law, we have international law more broadly, and we apply it to that, and we come to our conclusions. Of course, you can have a dispute about whether it is this or that or the other, but at least we use norms and apply it to the facts. But the missing thing is compassion. And I sometimes, when I was spending a couple of days now in New York, I sometimes find the discussions, even at the UN in New York, sometimes so removed from the human element.
Yes.
And I think it is really our task, and we are trying, I think all of us are trying it through communications and so forth, but we need to think more creatively, and please share ideas with us. How do we bring it back to the actual suffering and the pain of everyone? Because it does move people, and I think we need to overcome this numbness thing. And what I often see in conflicts is that the pain of the other is not seen. The suffering of the other is not seen. And we really need to bring it back to this basic humanity issue. And that is what human rights is, at the end of the day, is all about. And it goes a bit to the psychological element. Compassion is, I had a very interesting conversation, I don't know if you know John Kabat-Zinn, on mindfulness and bringing mindfulness into diplomacy. Because you don't hear much about, in a very aggressive, competitive environment, you don't hear much about mindfulness. You don't hear much about soft power. You don't hear much about how you engage. But, the vast majority of the world engages very differently from what we know here in the US or in Europe. And if you want to convince anyone, you will have to find a very different way of communicating. So this is extremely important because if we see that this model of crass, I would say almost macho behavior is now the new role model, which frankly is one that we thought we had overcome and we had put back into the history books. We need a leadership that is the leadership of the future is not what we see today. The leadership of the future is one that is mindful, that picks up, that is emotionally intelligent, socially intelligent, and that actually connects and communicates in different ways. And I think what I sometimes see, even in social media influencers, as I was talking about toxic masculinity or toxic concepts of masculinity, you go back into, frankly, misogyny. I was surprised, how many followers Andrew Tate has among young people, for example. It's violent misogyny even. How can that be? Is this really what the future will bring? Of course not. We know that. So how do we provide, what alternative do we show, and what role models can we bring out that shows that the world can be a kinder place, is a place that is civil, is a place that is respectful, and is also is a place where we care about each other? And how can we bring it to that point? I think it's going to be a big challenge. On the 51 Convention, human rights, I mean, of course, the 51 Convention, well, I would, of course, argue that the principle of non-refoulement includes non-rejection at the border. So I think if you deny someone entry when they seek asylum, you have an issue of non-refoulement. And there is, when I was in UNHCR, we asked Eliu Lauterbach and Daniel Bethlehem to do a study for us, a legal opinion on the principle of non-refoulement, and it was now 20 years ago, whether it is customary international law. And of course, they came to the conclusion that it is customary international law, and it dealt with access. Well, I have to say, if I look at the laws around the world, including in Europe, the discussions that we see also in the United States, you sort of wonder whether we are throwing out the rule of law dimension in this, and we need to really bring it back. And actually in Europe, you have the European Court of Human Rights that comes in very helpfully because it does provide the guardrails. But I mean, if I look at Hungary, for example, some of the proposals that we had seen in the past were certainly not in line with international human rights law and the 51 Convention. But it's something to watch very carefully because, again, if you see it erode, it becomes the new norm. And non-rejection at the frontier, I mean, as I said, the history was, I mean, even in Switzerland, you had, during the Second World War, you had people trying to flee Nazi Germany and they were rejected at the border, which is why non-refoulement includes that. Mm-hmm. We have a dialogue with the big tech companies. I mean, I was in Silicon Valley last year myself, and we even have a project, what we call a B-Tech project. They cooperate with us because I think some of them have, as you know, very sophisticated human rights policies. They have human rights programs. So this engagement with the tech companies is extremely important. I even wrote an open letter to Elon Musk. Some of you may remember when he took over Twitter, because he had fired the human rights team, and we have this privileged channel of communication with the different companies, and we actually had an issue, and we wanted to get in touch with them, and we found out that they had just been fired, so there was no contact on their side at the time, Twitter, and that prompted me to write that letter because we did want to show there are human rights obligations that apply to you as a private company, business and human rights. And this is exactly the type of things that we have to, and I have to say, a lot of them are very cooperative with us and they want to be seen to be doing the right thing. How you deal with it, this is the last question. I mean, regulation, of course, you have the European experience with the Digital Services Act, with the Digital Market Act, where they have tried to do precisely that, including on artificial intelligence. But I also agree with you, we have seen, I was very worried about the Cybercrime Convention. I don't know if those of you who have followed the debate within the United Nations, because I can see that some governments are going to use this to crack down on civic space, to crack down on freedom of expression, and they are going to use it to persecute people. And we need to watch that very carefully. We have seen, remember in Bangladesh, during Sheikh Hasina's time, they drafted a law, it was called the Cyber Security Act or something, I can't remember the exact title, but it was used precisely for that purpose that you have mentioned. So one has to be extremely careful. And that's why you need the human rights principles set out in any of this type of regulations that deals with these tensions and mitigates them, so that we are not inadvertently contributing to the crackdown on freedom of expression.
Do you want to make a final case for this next generation to become human rights advocates?
Yes, In whatever you're going to do, I mean, I think that's a very important point because I think whatever you're going to do, in whatever function you're in, I really think that human rights have to be part and parcel of not only of the education, but also of your understanding. Because whether you're an economist, whether you are a policy person, it's always good to have the human rights prism when you actually try to tackle a problem. And we have seen this, you have almost this compartmentalization of human rights. It's done by the national human rights institutions, it's done by some lawyers, by ACLU and others. But no, actually human rights needs to be understood by everyone, by all disciplines, whether you are a climate change activist or a climate change researcher. You need to understand what human rights is, because it brings you back to the fundamentals of rights of the individuals. And that's what, at the end of the day, we are here for. And the big problem on the tech side, I do think that human agency could be replaced with algorithms that are going to be very dangerous. And that's why I also wish that in not only the ones that we know and the tech companies that talk to us and understand human rights, but it's also the developers.
Right.
We actually need to make sure that human rights gets into all disciplines, because it is so transversal. And you need everyone, the medical staff, they need to understand, they have to have a basic understanding of human rights. So
human rights belongs everywhere.
It belongs everywhere. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.